How does a nation descend into madness? Does it happen overnight, with a loud, dramatic explosion of evil? Or is it a slower, quieter, more creeping process? Is it a series of small compromises, of ignored warnings, of polite accommodations that happens while the rest of the world is looking the other way, assuring itself that everything is still normal? Erik Larson's masterpiece of historical suspense, In the Garden of Beasts, is a chilling and unforgettable journey into the very heart of this question. It is the true story of America's first ambassador to Nazi Germany, William Dodd, and his family. In 1933, they moved to Berlin and were given a front-row seat to the birth of the Nazi nightmare. But this is not a grand story of war or epic historical battles. It is a much more intimate and in some ways more terrifying story. It is the story of how good, decent, and intelligent people can fail to recognize a monstrous threat when it doesn't fit their preconceived notions. It's a story about the slow, horrifying awakening to an evil that was, for a time, hiding in plain sight. It is a philosophical case study in the subtle, creeping, and terrifying normalization of the unthinkable, an unlikely ambassador in a naive world. To understand the story, you must first understand the man at its center, William Dodd, and the world he came from. Dodd was, by all accounts, an entirely unlikely choice for such a critical diplomatic post. He was not a wealthy socialite or a career diplomat. He was a quiet, frugal, and deeply intellectual history professor from Chicago. He was a Jeffersonian Democrat, a believer in reason, dialogue, and the fundamental decency of people. In 1933, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt offered him the position of ambassador to Germany, the world was in a state of confusion about the new German Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. The prevailing attitude in the American State Department, and indeed across much of Europe, was one of cautious and often condescending optimism. They saw Hitler and his Nazi party as a temporary and almost comical political aberration. They were seen as loud, thuggish, and unsophisticated, but it was widely believed that the responsibilities of governing would moderate them, that they would eventually be tamed by the more traditional conservative forces in German politics. No one was taking them as a serious long-term threat. William Dodd shared this naive optimism. He accepted the post, believing his job would be to gently guide the new German government back towards a more civilized path, and perhaps more importantly, to get the Germans to start repaying their war debts to American banks. He and his family, his wife Maddie, his son Bill, and his vivacious grown-up daughter Martha, packed their bags and moved to Berlin, believing they were embarking on an exciting European adventure. They had no idea they were walking into the engine room of a gathering storm. The seduction of a new Berlin. The central figure in the early part of the book is not the quiet ambassador but his glamorous and free-spirited daughter, Martha Dodd. Martha's story is a powerful and unsettling metaphor for the world's initial seduction by the facade of the Nazi regime. Martha was a modern woman, smart, beautiful, and sexually liberated. When she arrived in Berlin, she was completely enchanted. After the gray misery of the Great Depression in America, Berlin in 1933 seemed like a city bursting with new life and energy. The streets were clean, there was a palpable sense of national pride and purpose, and she was immediately swept up into the highest echelons of Nazi social life. She found the Nazi officials she met to be charming, intelligent, and dashing. She attended lavish parties, she was courted by powerful men. She began a series of affairs, most notably with Rudolf Diels, the first head of the newly formed secret police, the Gestapo, and later with Boris Vinogradov, a handsome and charismatic press officer at the Soviet embassy, who was also a secret agent. Through Martha's eyes, we see the seductive mask of the early Nazi regime. We see the pageantry, the torchlight parades, the powerful rhetoric of national renewal. She, like so many other foreign observers at the time, was initially willing to overlook the darker undercurrents, to dismiss the reports of violence against Jews and communists as the temporary, unfortunate excesses of a young revolution. Her diary entries and letters from this period are filled with an almost breathless excitement about the new Germany. She was, in a very real sense, falling in love with a monster that was wearing a charming and sophisticated disguise. Whispers from the Garden of Beasts. While Martha was being seduced by the glamour of the regime, her father, the quiet historian, was beginning to see the darkness that was lurking just beneath the surface. The book's title, In the Garden of Beasts, refers to the Tiergarten, the massive park in the center of Berlin where the Dodds' residence was located. The Tiergarten was a place of immense beauty and civilized grace, a place where people would stroll on a Sunday afternoon, but it was also surrounded by the centers of Nazi power. It becomes a metaphor for Berlin itself, a beautiful garden filled with polite and cultured people, but with savage, predatory beasts lurking just at its edges and increasingly within it. William Dodd begins to hear the whispers. He hears stories from his Jewish friends and colleagues who are being summarily fired from their jobs at universities and in the government. He receives reports of American tourists being beaten in the streets by Nazi stormtroopers for not giving the Heil Hitler salute. He learns of the establishment of the first concentration camps, like Dachau, which were initially for political prisoners. Larson masterfully builds a sense of creeping dread. He chronicles the slow, systematic, and entirely legal process by which the Nazis dismantled German democracy. The Reichstag fire, the emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties, the Gleichschaltung or coordination, which brought every aspect of German life, from the press to the judiciary, under Nazi control. Dodd, the historian, recognizes these patterns. He sees the chilling parallels to other dark moments in history. He begins to understand that the violence and the persecution are not just the random acts of a few undisciplined thugs. They are the deliberate and central policy of the state. The excesses that the world was willing to overlook were not a bug in the system, they were the system itself. The polite, charming officials he met at diplomatic functions during the day were the same men who were signing orders for torture and murder at night. The ambassador's lonely awakening. As William Dodd's understanding of the true nature of the regime deepens, he begins to change. The naive optimist who had arrived in Berlin hoping to be a friendly mediator becomes a horrified and increasingly desperate Cassandra, a prophet of doom whose warnings no one wants to hear. He begins to send a series of increasingly urgent and alarmed cables back to his superiors at the State Department in Washington. He describes the persecution of the Jews. He warns that the Nazi regime is a threat not just to its own people, but to the peace of the entire world. He tries to explain that these are not reasonable men with whom one can negotiate. They are fanatics, driven by a dark and violent ideology. But his warnings are met with a wall of indifference and even hostility. The State Department in the 1930s was a deeply conservative and in many ways an anti-Semitic institution. They saw Dodd as a naive academic, an amateur who was getting overly emotional and was not suited to the delicate art of diplomacy. His cables are ignored. His requests for the U.S. to take a stronger moral stand are rebuffed. He is told again and again to be more diplomatic, to not offend the German government, to focus on the important issue of getting the American loans repaid. This is one of the most heartbreaking and philosophically important parts of the book. It is a devastating case study in institutional cowardice and willful blindness. The American government, and indeed most of the Western world, had the information. They had a man on the ground telling them the truth. But they chose to look away. They chose to appease, to normalize, to believe the comfortable lie that things weren't really that bad, because the alternative, confronting the monstrous reality of the Nazi regime, was too difficult and too frightening to contemplate. Dodd's lonely and frustrating battle against his own government is a powerful testament to the courage it takes to speak the truth to a power that does not want to hear it. The end of the affair, a family's disillusionment. As the ambassador is having his political awakening, his daughter Martha is having her own equally painful personal one. The glamorous and exciting world she had fallen in love with is revealed to be a facade, hiding a world of unimaginable brutality. The final shattering moment for her comes in the summer of 1934, during the infamous Night of the Long Knives. Over the course of a single bloody weekend, Hitler ordered the murder of hundreds of his own political rivals and early supporters within the Nazi Party, including Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, the stormtroopers. Martha is horrified. She realizes that the charming, powerful men she has been socializing with, the men she has found so attractive, are in fact cold-blooded murderers, capable of killing their own friends to consolidate their power. Her lover Rudolf Diels, the former head of the Gestapo, narrowly escapes being executed himself and has to go into hiding. The mask has been ripped off. The seductive party is over. The beautiful garden is revealed to be a slaughterhouse. Martha's disillusionment is total and complete. She, like her father, begins to see the Nazi regime for what it truly is, a criminal enterprise masquerading as a government. Her personal story of romance and heartbreak becomes a powerful allegory for the world's own disastrous and naive affair with Hitler's Germany. The Dodd family leaves Germany in 1937, their initial optimism completely shattered. William Dodd returns to America a changed man, and he spends his final years trying, mostly in vain, to warn his country about the coming war and the moral catastrophe that was unfolding in Europe. The final message of In the Garden of Beasts is a powerful and timeless warning from history. It shows us that tyranny does not arrive in a sudden, violent explosion. It takes root slowly, in 1,000 small, unheeded moments. It grows in the soil of our own denial, our own complacency, our own desire to believe that things are not as bad as they seem. The book is a story about the danger of underestimating threats, of normalizing the unthinkable, and of the moral courage it takes to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. It is a deep philosophical inquiry into the anatomy of a nightmare. If you believe that we must study the past to protect the future, then you are in the right place. Welcome to Geeky Philosopher, subscribe, and let's continue to explore the vital lessons of history together.